Before we begin, if you're fascinated by the hidden stories of Cold War espionage and the real human cost behind intelligence operations, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We uncover these documented cases every week, bringing you the truth behind some of history's most consequential betrayals. On the afternoon of October 9th, 1989, a financial analyst named Sandra Grimes sat in her cubicle on the fourth floor of the Central Intelligence Agency's headquarters in Langley, Virginia, reviewing routine security paperwork when she noticed something that would ultimately expose one of the most damaging espionage cases in American intelligence history. Grimes, 42 years old, had worked in the CIA's Soviet East European Division for 16 years. Her current assignment involved reviewing financial disclosure forms submitted by agency employees, forms required annually from anyone with access to classified information. The forms were designed to detect conflicts of interest, unexplained wealth, or financial vulnerabilities that might make an employee susceptible to recruitment by foreign intelligence services. The form Grimes was examining that afternoon belonged to Aldrich Ames, a 48-year-old CIA officer who worked in the Counterintelligence Center analyzing Soviet intelligence operations. According to the financial disclosure form, dated April 15, 1989, Ames had reported total assets of approximately $300,000, a figure that included his home, retirement accounts, and savings. For a CIA officer at Ames's grade level, with his years of service and his salary of approximately $60,000 per year, this amount of wealth was not unusual. What caught Grimes's attention was not the number itself, but rather her own memory of having seen Ames 6 months earlier in the CIA headquarters parking lot, climbing out of a bright red Jaguar sedan. Grimes knew that a new Jaguar in 1989 cost approximately $50,000. She also knew Ames's salary. The mathematics troubled her. A CIA officer earning $60,000 per year, paying taxes, supporting a family, and maintaining a household could not reasonably afford a $50,000 car unless they had independent wealth or had come into money through inheritance or some other legitimate source. But Ames's financial disclosure form made no mention of any inheritance, no reference to any income beyond his CIA salary and his wife's salary as a cultural affairs officer at the Colombian Embassy in Washington. Grimes made a note in the margin of the form and placed it in a folder marked for follow-up. Then she returned to reviewing other paperwork. At that moment she could not have known that the discrepancy she had noticed would take nearly 5 more years to investigate fully, or that it would eventually reveal an espionage operation that had compromised virtually every significant CIA asset in the Soviet Union and had led to the execution of at least 10 human sources who had been working for American intelligence. Aldrich Ames had been born on May 26, 1941, in River Falls, Wisconsin. His father, Carlton Ames, was a college professor who later joined the Central Intelligence Agency during the 1950s, working as an analyst and case officer focused on Burma and Southeast Asian affairs. His mother, Rachel Aldrich Ames, came from a prominent Massachusetts family. By all accounts, Aldrich, known to family and colleagues as Rick, had a comfortable middle-class childhood, though one marked by his father's frequent overseas assignments and the family's constant relocations. Rick Ames attended McLean High School in Northern Virginia, graduating in 1959. His academic performance was adequate, but not exceptional. Teachers described him as intelligent but somewhat lazy, capable of strong work when motivated, but prone to doing the minimum required. He enrolled at the University of Chicago, but dropped out after his sophomore year, uncertain about his academic direction. In 1962, at the age of 21, Rick Ames was hired by the Central Intelligence Agency as a clerk typist, the lowest level of employment at the agency. His initial assignment was in the Records Integration Division, filing documents and maintaining administrative paperwork. The work was tedious and poorly paid, but it represented entry into the organization his father had served. Over the following years, Ames gradually advanced through the CIA's bureaucracy. He completed his undergraduate degree at George Washington University while working at the agency, taking night classes and finishing in 1967. He was accepted into the Career Trainee Program, which prepared new officers for operational assignments. He completed training in 1968 and was assigned to the Soviet East European Division. In 1969, Rick Ames was assigned to his first overseas posting, Ankara, Turkey. His role was to serve as a case officer working under diplomatic cover at the American Embassy, identifying and recruiting Soviet intelligence officers who might be vulnerable to approach. According to later accounts from colleagues who served with him in Ankara, Ames was personable, intelligent, and capable, but also showed early signs of weaknesses that would eventually define his career. He drank heavily, socialized extensively, and sometimes displayed poor judgment in professional situations. During his tour in Ankara, which lasted from 1969 to 1972, Ames met Nancy Jane Segabarth, a fellow CIA officer. They married in 1969, shortly after his arrival in Turkey. The marriage produced one child, a daughter named Allison, born in 1970. Colleagues who knew the couple in Ankara described the relationship as troubled from the beginning, marked by arguments, excessive drinking on both sides, and fundamental incompatibilities. Ames returned to CIA headquarters in Langley in 1972 and spent the next 4 years working in various capacities within the Soviet East European Division. His performance evaluations during this period were mixed. Supervisors praised his analytical abilities and his knowledge of Soviet intelligence operations, but they also noted problems with alcohol, with meeting deadlines, and with what one evaluation described as a certain arrogance in his interactions with colleagues who he perceives as less intelligent than himself. In 1976, Ames was assigned to New York City, where he worked under cover at the United Nations, attempting to recruit Soviet diplomats and intelligence officers. This assignment lasted until 1981 and was, by most accounts, the most productive period of his legitimate career. He successfully recruited at least 2 Soviet officials to provide information to the CIA. But the New York assignment also deepened his alcohol problems. He developed a reputation for drinking heavily at social functions, for sometimes appearing at work hungover, and for occasionally missing meetings or failing to file required reports on time. His marriage to Nancy deteriorated further. They separated in 1981, shortly after returning to Washington, and divorced in 1983. The divorce was financially difficult for Ames. Nancy received custody of their daughter Allison, and Ames was ordered to pay child support and alimony that, together with his own living expenses, consumed most of his CIA salary. According to financial records later examined by investigators, Ames's bank accounts in 1983 and 1984 showed constant overdrafts and minimal savings. He moved into a small apartment in Arlington, Virginia, and lived a lifestyle that colleagues described as borderline shabby, wearing the same wrinkled suits repeatedly, driving a 1978 Chevrolet with rust spots and a cracked windshield, bringing sandwiches wrapped in aluminum foil from home to save money on meals. In 1981, shortly before his separation from Nancy, Ames had met Maria del Rosario Casas Dupuy, a Colombian woman working as a cultural affairs officer at the Colombian Embassy in Washington. Rosario, as she was known, was 28 years old, 12 years younger than Ames, attractive, educated, and from a prominent family in Bogota. According to later accounts, Ames pursued her intensely. They began a romantic relationship that continued through his separation and divorce from Nancy. Rosario came from a wealthy Colombian family and had expectations regarding lifestyle and material comfort that far exceeded what Ames could provide on his CIA salary. Friends of the couple later recalled that Rosario expressed frustration about Ames's financial situation, about the small apartment he lived in with its cheap furniture and peeling paint, about his inability to take her on expensive vacations or to purchase the luxury items she had grown up with. According to testimony from Maria Larson, a friend of Rosario's who later cooperated with FBI investigators, Rosario had told her in early 1985 that she was considering ending the relationship because Rick will never be able to give me the life I want. The relationship created pressure, psychological and financial, that Ames later cited as one factor in his decision to betray his country. But this explanation, while convenient, obscures the fundamental moral choice he made. Many people face financial pressure and romantic disappointment without committing treason. On April 16, 1985, at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, Aldrich Ames walked through the main entrance of the Soviet Embassy at 1125 16th Street Northwest in Washington, D.C. He wore a gray suit that needed pressing and carried a brown leather briefcase. According to declassified Soviet intelligence records obtained after the Cold War ended, he approached the reception desk and told the Soviet employee on duty that he needed to speak with someone from the embassy's security office. He said he had information that would be of interest to the Soviet government. The receptionist, following standard protocol for such approaches, asked Ames to wait. Approximately 15 minutes later, a man identifying himself as Sergei Chuvakin, a diplomat who Ames likely knew was actually a KGB officer, emerged and led Ames to a small conference room on the embassy's second floor. The room had no windows. There was a table, 4 chairs, and according to CIA officers who had been inside the Soviet embassy on official business, a camera concealed in the ceiling light fixture that recorded all meetings. What happened in that room over the next 40 minutes would destroy the CIA's Soviet operations and lead to the deaths of at least 10 people. According to Ames's later testimony and declassified Soviet records, he told Chuvakin that he was a CIA officer working in counterintelligence and that he had access to information about CIA operations against the Soviet Union. He said he was willing to provide this information in exchange for money. When asked how much money, Ames said he needed $50. 000 immediately to resolve pressing financial problems. Chuvakin asked what information Ames was prepared to provide to demonstrate the value of his access. This was the moment, the single point at which Ames could have changed his mind, could have walked out, could have reported the meeting to CIA security, and claimed he had been testing Soviet recruitment procedures. Instead, he opened his briefcase and withdrew a manila folder containing documents he had removed from CIA headquarters. The documents included the names of 3 Soviet officials who were providing information to the CIA, Sergei Motorin and Valery Martinov, both KGB officers working in Washington, and a third asset whose identity remains classified. Ames handed the folder to Chuvakin. According to Ames's testimony, Chuvakin read through the documents for approximately 10 minutes without speaking. Then he looked up and said in English, "This is very serious. You understand what you are doing?" Ames said he understood. Chuvakin told him to wait, left the room, and returned 30 minutes later with an envelope containing $50,000 in cash, 100 bills in denominations of $500 each. Chuvakin also gave Ames instructions for future contact. He was to return to the Soviet embassy on June 13, 1985, at which time he would provide additional information and receive further instructions. Ames placed the envelope in his briefcase, shook hands with Chuvakin, and left the embassy at approximately 4:15 p.m. He drove directly to a branch of Dominion Bank in Arlington, arriving at approximately 4:45 p.m., 15 minutes before closing. According to bank records later subpoenaed by federal investigators, Ames deposited $22,000 in cash into his checking account that afternoon. He kept the remaining $28,000 in cash, which he later used to pay off credit card debts, overdue alimony, and outstanding bills. Within 3 weeks, Ames's financial situation had stabilized. He was no longer receiving collection notices. His creditors stopped calling. He could afford to take Rosario to expensive restaurants and to purchase jewelry for her birthday in May 1985. But the cost of this financial relief was measured in human lives. Within 6 weeks of Ames's April meeting at the Soviet embassy, Soviet counterintelligence officers arrested Sergei Motorin in Moscow. He had been recalled from his Washington posting under the pretext of routine reassignment. Upon arriving at KGB headquarters on Lubyanka Square, he was taken not to his expected office but to an interrogation room in the basement. According to accounts from former KGB officers who later defected, Motorin was interrogated for 3 days. His interrogators showed him classified CIA documents that could only have come from someone inside American intelligence. They asked him what information he had provided to the Americans. They demanded the names of other Soviet officials who might be working for the CIA. Motorin, realizing his situation was hopeless, confirmed that he had been working for the FBI. He was formally arrested, charged with treason under Article 64 of the Soviet Criminal Code, tried in a closed military court, and convicted. On September 24, 1987, he was executed by firing squad at Lubyanka Prison. He was 37 years old. He left behind a wife, Irina, and a 10-year-old son, Mikhail. According to limited accounts from people who knew the family, Irina was interrogated repeatedly by KGB investigators who suspected she might have known about her husband's cooperation with American intelligence. She was eventually cleared of involvement but lost her job as a schoolteacher. Mikhail was expelled from his school. The family was forced to move from Moscow to a small town in Siberia, where they lived under assumed names. Valery Martinov suffered the same fate. He was recalled to Moscow in October 1985, arrested upon arrival, interrogated, tried, convicted, and executed by firing squad on May 28, 1987. He was 35 years old. He left behind a wife, Natalia, and 2 young daughters, ages 7 and 4. The family was not permitted to attend his trial or execution. They were told he had been convicted of treason and would not be returning. According to testimony Natalia later gave to Russian human rights investigators in the 1990s after the Soviet Union collapsed, she and her daughters lived for years, not knowing exactly when or how Martinov had died. Knowing only that he was gone and that their association with a convicted traitor had destroyed their social standing and their economic security. On June 13, 1985, as instructed, Aldrich Ames returned to the Soviet embassy. This time he brought significantly more information. He provided a comprehensive list of every Soviet official he knew or suspected of working for the CIA. The list included more than 20 names. Among them was Dmitry Polyakov. Polyakov was the most valuable Soviet asset the CIA had ever recruited. He was a major general in the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, and he had been providing information to the United States for more than 20 years. Since first making contact with American intelligence officers in 1961. The information Polyakov had provided over those 2 decades had been extraordinary in scope and value. Details about Soviet military capabilities, weapons systems development, intelligence operations, strategic planning, and internal Kremlin politics. CIA analysts estimated that Polyakov's information had contributed significantly to American strategic planning throughout the 1960s and 1970s and had helped the United States maintain military parity with the Soviet Union during some of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War. Polyakov's code name was Top Hat. His true identity was among the most closely guarded secrets in American intelligence. Only a small number of CIA officers knew who he was. Aldrich Ames was one of them. When Ames handed over the list of names in June 1985, Polyakov's name was on it. Polyakov was arrested by Soviet counterintelligence in July 1986, more than a year after Ames betrayed him. The delay reflected Soviet intelligence's methodical approach to exploiting Ames's information. Rather than immediately arresting everyone Ames had identified, which would have alerted the CIA that they had a penetration and might have helped them identify Ames as the source, the Soviets arrested people gradually, over months and years, in ways that could potentially be explained by improved Soviet counterintelligence work or by technical compromises rather than human betrayal. But eventually, Polyakov's arrest came. He was 65 years old, a decorated military officer who had served the Soviet Union for more than 40 years, while simultaneously serving what he believed to be the cause of peace by providing information to the United States. According to declassified CIA documents, Polyakov's motivation for working with American intelligence was not money. He refused almost all payment beyond minimal expenses, but rather his conviction that Soviet military aggression and the arms race threatened humanity and that the United States needed accurate information about Soviet capabilities to avoid miscalculation. Polyakov was interrogated extensively. According to accounts from former KGB officers, his interrogators showed him evidence of his communications with the CIA, photographs of dead drops, recordings of meetings. They wanted him to confess and to provide information about how he had evaded detection for so long. Polyakov, according to these accounts, admitted his cooperation with the Americans but refused to express remorse or to claim he had made a mistake. He maintained that what he had done was necessary and that history would judge him correctly. He was tried in secret by a military tribunal, convicted of high treason, and sentenced to death. On March 15, 1988, he was taken from his cell at Lefortovo prison in Moscow to an execution chamber, where he was executed by a single gunshot to the back of the head, the standard Soviet method for executing traitors. His wife, Nina, was not informed of his execution until weeks later. She was told that her husband had been convicted of treason, but was given no details about his cooperation with the Americans, no explanation of why he had done what he did. She died in 1992, never having fully understood her husband's actions or having had the opportunity to hear his explanation. For the compensation he received for betraying Polyakov and the others, Ames was paid an additional $100,000 by Soviet intelligence in June 1985. This payment, combined with the $50,000 from April, gave Ames a total of $150,000, more money than he had ever possessed. He deposited most of it in various bank accounts over the following months, making deposits in amounts ranging from $5,000 to $15,000 to avoid triggering federal reporting requirements for large cash transactions. On August 10, 1985, Aldrich Ames and Rosario Casas were married in a small ceremony in Arlington, Virginia. Approximately 20 people attended, including several of Ames's CIA colleagues who had no suspicion that their co-worker had become a traitor 3 months earlier. The newlyweds honeymooned in Mexico. According to credit card records, they stayed at expensive resorts, ate at high-end restaurants, and spent more than $8,000 during their 2-week trip, an amount that should have been impossible for someone with Ames's salary, but which he now could afford easily. Within the CIA, the loss of assets in the Soviet Union during 1985 and 1986 triggered alarm and confusion. Case officers who had been successfully running Soviet sources suddenly found that their agents had disappeared, arrested, executed, or simply vanished. Communications channels that had been functioning reliably went silent. Dead drops were left uncollected, secret meetings were missed. By late 1986, it was clear to CIA leadership that something catastrophic had happened, but the cause was not immediately clear. Multiple explanations were considered. Perhaps Soviet counterintelligence had improved its surveillance capabilities. Perhaps communications had been compromised, codes broken, or transmissions intercepted. Perhaps there was a human penetration, but if so, who was it? The possibility that the compromise came from within was psychologically difficult for the agency to accept. In 1986, CIA leadership established a small investigative unit to examine the compromises. The unit, consisting of 4 analysts working part-time while maintaining their regular duties, spent months reviewing operational files, looking for patterns, considering possibilities. They made lists of personnel who had access to information about the compromised operations. They reviewed security files looking for suspicious behavior. But with limited resources, limited authority to investigate colleagues, and the sheer complexity of intelligence operations involving hundreds of personnel, the investigation moved slowly. During this same period, from 1985 through 1991, Aldrich Ames continued his espionage with remarkable brazenness. He met regularly with Soviet intelligence handlers, sometimes at the Soviet embassy, sometimes at locations in South America or Europe when he traveled for legitimate CIA business. Between 1985 and 1991, Ames received more than $2 million from Soviet and later Russian intelligence services. The payments came at irregular intervals, $50,000 here, $100,000 there, deposited into bank accounts or paid in cash during meetings with handlers, and he spent the money conspicuously. In early 1989, Ames and Rosario began house hunting in Arlington. They looked at properties in upscale neighborhoods, properties that cost far more than a CIA officer's salary could support. On February 28, 1989, they made an offer on a house at 2512 North Randolph Street in the Waverly Hills neighborhood of Arlington, a 2-story colonial with 5 bedrooms, 3.5 bathrooms, a large yard, and a detached garage. The house was listed at $540,000. Ames offered to pay the full asking price in cash, no mortgage, no financing, closing within 30 days. The seller's real estate agent later recalled being surprised by the offer. Cash purchases were unusual for homes in that price range. The agent asked Ames where the funds were coming from. Ames explained that his wife came from a wealthy Colombian family and that they were receiving family money to purchase the house. This explanation was plausible. Foreign nationals with family wealth did sometimes purchase expensive properties for relatives working in Washington. The transaction proceeded without any flags being raised. On March 31, 1989, the sale closed. Ames provided a certified check for $540,000 drawn on a Dominion bank account. Public real estate records showed the purchase, listing Aldrich Ames and Rosario Ames as the owners. The house had been paid for entirely with money provided by Russian intelligence, though no one outside of Ames, his handlers, and eventually federal investigators would know this. Ames also purchased a new car. In July 1989, he went to a Jaguar dealership in Tysons Corner, Virginia, and purchased a 1989 Jaguar XJ6 sedan in bright red. The car cost $49,500. According to the dealership's sales records, Ames paid in cash, not with a cashier's check or financing, but with actual currency counted out in $100 bills. The salesperson who handled the transaction, a man named Gary Richardson, later told FBI investigators that he found the cash payment unusual and had asked Ames about it. Ames had explained that he had recently sold some stock and preferred to pay cash rather than deal with financing. Richardson thought this was odd, but not suspicious enough to report. It was this red Jaguar that Sandra Grimes had seen in the CIA parking lot in October 1989, the sighting that had troubled her when she later reviewed Ames's financial disclosure forms. But her observation, noted in agency records, did not immediately trigger any focused investigation. The note was filed. No follow-up action was taken. Other colleagues noticed Ames's sudden prosperity. David Edger, a CIA officer who shared an office with Ames in 1989 and 1990, later testified that Ames had begun wearing expensive suits, Armani and Hugo Boss, that obviously cost more than most CIA officers could afford. Ames carried a Montblanc pen that retailed for more than $400. He wore a Rolex watch. During lunch conversations, he mentioned vacations he and Rosario had taken to Europe, staying at luxury hotels in Rome, Paris, and London. Edger mentioned these observations to other colleagues. They joked about it. Someone suggested that Rosario must have family money. Someone else wondered if Ames had inherited wealth from a relative. A few expressed the observations to security personnel. But these concerns, when they were raised, were not pursued aggressively. The CIA's security apparatus in the late 1980s and early 1990s was understaffed, overwhelmed with routine clearance reviews, and structured to identify external threats rather than internal betrayal. This institutional failure reflected broader problems. The assumption within the intelligence community was that officers who had passed background investigations and polygraph examinations could be trusted. The idea that one of their own might betray them was psychologically difficult to accept and procedurally difficult to investigate without specific evidence. The investigation into the compromises gained new urgency in 1991. By that time, the pattern of losses was unmistakable. Virtually every significant CIA human source in the Soviet Union had been compromised. The agency's ability to recruit and run assets against Moscow had been effectively destroyed. CIA leadership recognized that this could not be explained by coincidence or by improved Soviet counterintelligence alone. There had to be a penetration, and it had to be someone with broad access to operational information. In March 1991, CIA Director William Webster authorized the formation of a joint CIA-FBI task force dedicated exclusively to identifying the source of the compromises. The task force was small, initially just 4 people, and operated in strict secrecy. The members were Jean Vertefeuille, 58 years old, a veteran CIA analyst who had spent 3 decades working Soviet operations, Sandra Grimes, now 44 years old, and 2 FBI agents, Les Weiser and Jim Milburn, Both experienced counterintelligence investigators. Their mandate was to systematically review everyone who had access to information about the compromised operations and to develop a list of suspects. The methodology was methodical and time-consuming. They created detailed matrices showing which CIA officers had access to which specific operations. They cross-referenced access with the timing of compromises when assets had been arrested or had disappeared. They reviewed personnel files, security files, travel records, and financial disclosure forms for dozens of CIA employees. By mid-1992, after more than a year of analysis, the task force had narrowed their list to approximately 40 suspects. These were officers who had access to information about multiple compromised operations and who had been in positions where they could have provided that information to Soviet intelligence. Aldrich Ames was on the list. But he was not initially among the top priorities. Other officers had similar access patterns, similar opportunities, and in some cases more obvious behavioral problems or foreign contacts that made them seem more suspicious. What eventually focused the investigation specifically on Ames was the financial evidence. In August 1992, the task force requested detailed financial records for all 40 suspects. This required working with the FBI, which had legal authority to subpoena bank records that the CIA could not obtain independently. The process took several months. On November 12, 1992, a Friday afternoon, FBI agent Les Weiser received from the Dominion Bank a large box containing financial records for Aldrich Ames, spanning the period from 1985 to 1992. The box contained checking account statements, savings account statements, records of deposits and withdrawals, and copies of checks. Weiser spent that evening and most of the weekend reviewing the documents. What he found was extraordinary. Between April 1985 and November 1992, Ames had deposited more than $1.3 million into various accounts in his name and in Rosario's name. The deposits had come in irregular amounts: $10,000, $23,000, $50,000, $97,000, and at irregular intervals, sometimes monthly, sometimes with gaps of several months. The deposits were consistently in cash or wire transfers, with no apparent legitimate source. On Monday, November 16th, Weiser brought the records to Jean Vertefeuille and Sandra Grimes at CIA headquarters. They spent several hours reviewing the documents together. Grimes remembered her observation from 3 years earlier about the Jaguar and the financial disclosure form. She retrieved Ames's file and found the note she had written in October 1989. The pattern was now clear. Ames had been living far beyond his means for years, and the timing of his unexplained wealth coincided exactly with the period when CIA assets had been compromised. The task force presented their findings to senior CIA and FBI leadership on November 20th, 1992. They recommended that Ames be designated as the primary suspect and that intensive surveillance be initiated immediately. Authorization was granted. On December 1st, 1992, the FBI began what would become one of the most comprehensive domestic surveillance operations in the agency's history. FBI surveillance teams, working in rotating shifts to avoid detection, began watching Ames's house at 2512 North Randolph Street. They documented his daily routine, leaving for work each morning around 7:45 a.m., arriving at CIA headquarters around 8:30 a.m., leaving work between 5 and 6 p.m., stopping occasionally at grocery stores or restaurants, arriving home by 7 p.m. They photographed everyone who came to the house, every car that parked on the street, every delivery that arrived. The FBI also obtained authorization from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court to install electronic surveillance. On the night of January 8, 1993, while Ames and Rosario were attending a dinner party at a colleague's house, FBI technical specialists entered the Ames residence through a basement window. Over the next 4 hours, they installed miniature listening devices in the living room, master bedroom, and home office. They installed a device in Ames's telephone that would record all incoming and outgoing calls. They installed a device in his car, a small transmitter hidden behind the dashboard that would allow agents to track his movements and record conversations inside the vehicle. The surveillance produced results quickly. On January 14, 1993, listening devices recorded a conversation between Ames and Rosario in their home office. At approximately 9:30 p.m., after putting their young son, Paul, to bed, they discussed Ames's upcoming trip to Caracas, Venezuela, scheduled for February. According to FBI transcripts of the conversation, Rosario asked whether he would have time during the trip to take care of the other thing. Ames replied that yes, he planned to handle it on February 23rd. Rosario said, "Be careful. You know they're always watching." This conversation suggested that Ames planned to meet with his Russian handlers during the Venezuela trip. The FBI coordinated with the CIA to allow the trip to proceed while maintaining surveillance. On February 23, 1993, FBI agents conducting surveillance in Caracas observed Ames entering a restaurant called El Bodegón on Avenida Principal de las Mercedes at approximately 7 o'clock. 45 p.m. He was alone. He sat at a table in the back of the restaurant and ordered dinner. At approximately 8:15 p.m., a man identified by Venezuelan intelligence as Vladimir Mechulayev, a Russian diplomat assigned to the Russian embassy in Caracas and believed to be an SVR intelligence officer. The SVR was Russia's post-Soviet Foreign Intelligence Service, entered the restaurant and sat at a table approximately 15 feet from where Ames was sitting. The two men did not appear to acknowledge each other. They ate their separate dinners. But at approximately 8:35 p.m., Mechulayev stood up, walked past Ames's table, and as he passed, placed a folded newspaper on Ames's table. Ames picked up the newspaper and placed it in a briefcase beside his chair. The entire exchange lasted less than 5 seconds. Mechulayev left the restaurant. Ames finished his dinner, paid his bill, and returned to his hotel. FBI agents maintained surveillance of Ames for the remainder of his time in Caracas. On February 24th, he attended his official CIA meetings as scheduled. On February 25th, he went for a walk along a street called Avenida Francisco de Miranda. At a corner near a bus stop, he removed something from his jacket pocket and placed it inside a newspaper vending machine, taping it to the interior wall of the machine. FBI agents documented the action with telephoto photography. After Ames had left the area, Venezuelan intelligence officers working with the FBI retrieved the item. It was a small envelope containing what appeared to be several sheets of paper with typewritten text, possibly descriptions of CIA operations or responses to questions from his handlers. The Caracas surveillance provided strong evidence that Ames was actively engaged in espionage, but prosecutors and FBI leadership wanted more. They wanted to catch him in the act of removing classified information from CIA headquarters, wanted to search his house more thoroughly, wanted to build a case so comprehensive that Ames would have no option but to plead guilty. On October 9, 1993, 4 years to the day after Sandra Grimes had first noticed the discrepancy in Ames's financial disclosure form, the FBI obtained authorization to conduct a covert search of the Ames residence. The operation was planned meticulously. FBI agents had been monitoring the family's schedule for months. They knew that Rosario took their son Paul to a morning playgroup every Tuesday from 10 a.m. to noon. On Tuesday, October 12th, 1993, at approximately 10:15 a.m., after confirming that Rosario's car had left the neighborhood, a team of 6 FBI agents entered the house through the back door using a key they had obtained by making an impression from Rosario's key during an earlier operation. The search team had 4 objectives: locate any classified documents that Ames had removed from CIA headquarters, examine his personal computer and copy any relevant files, search for evidence of communication with Russian intelligence, and document anything else relevant to the investigation. They had been instructed to work quickly and to leave no evidence that the search had occurred. In Ames's home office on the second floor of the house, agents found a personal computer, a compact 386 desktop with a color monitor. One agent, specially trained in computer forensics, connected a device to the computer that allowed him to copy the entire hard drive without leaving any trace of the access. The copying process took approximately 45 minutes. While the computer was being copied, other agents searched the office. In a filing cabinet drawer, they found a folder labeled Tax Documents, 1991 to 1992. Inside the folder, mixed in with legitimate tax records, were several documents bearing classification markings, secret and top secret. The documents appeared to be CIA operational cables and intelligence reports that Ames had no legitimate reason to possess at home. Agents photographed each page, then carefully returned the documents to exactly the positions where they had been found. In a desk drawer, agents found a small address book. One page contained a handwritten list of what appeared to be dates and locations: December 15th, Sligo Creek, Bridge, North Side, and February 23rd, Caracas, usual location, 8 p.m. These entries appeared to document past meetings or communications with Russian handlers. The most incriminating evidence came from the computer files. After the search team had returned to FBI headquarters and analysts had examined the copied hard drive, they found multiple documents that appeared to be responses to questions from Russian intelligence. One file, dated September 1993 and labeled Answers.doc, contained information about current CIA operations against Russia, including details about technical surveillance capabilities and information about CIA officers working undercover. Another file contained a draft of a message to his handlers in which Ames wrote, "I understand your concerns about the new security protocols, and I agree that we need to be more careful. I recommend we suspend face-to-face meetings for the next 6 months and rely on dead drops only." These computer files, combined with the classified documents found in his home office, provided prosecutors with overwhelming evidence. But FBI leadership decided to continue surveillance for several more months, hoping to document additional meetings or communications that would further strengthen the case. Over the following months, surveillance documented several more suspicious activities. In December 1993, FBI agents observed Ames conducting what appeared to be a counter-surveillance detection route, a series of seemingly random stops and route changes designed to determine if he was being followed. He drove from his house to a shopping mall, parked, walked through the mall without purchasing anything, exited through a different door, returned to his car, drove to a second location, repeated the pattern, and eventually drove to a small park in Falls Church, Virginia. At the park, at approximately 2:15 p.m., Ames parked his car and walked to a children's playground. He sat on a bench for approximately 5 minutes, then stood, walked to a nearby trash receptacle, and deposited something inside, a plastic bag that appeared to contain papers. He then returned to his car and drove away. FBI agents waited until Ames had left the area, then retrieved the bag from the trash receptacle. Inside was an envelope containing several pages of typewritten notes describing recent conversations Ames had overheard at CIA headquarters regarding Russian operations. By January 1994, FBI and CIA leadership determined they had sufficient evidence to arrest Ames. Further surveillance risked allowing him to detect the investigation or to compromise additional operations. On January 24, 1994, prosecutors presented their case to a federal grand jury in Alexandria, Virginia. The grand jury returned indictments charging Aldrich Ames with conspiracy to commit espionage and multiple counts of espionage under federal law. The maximum penalty was death. The arrest was scheduled for Monday, February 21, 1994. FBI leadership decided to take Ames into custody as he left his house for work, ensuring that he would not have the opportunity to destroy evidence or alert his handlers. Surveillance teams were positioned around the Ames neighborhood beginning at 6 a.m. At approximately 8:15 a.m., Ames exited his house, carrying his briefcase, and walked to his car. He was now driving a gray Honda Accord, having sold the red Jaguar several months earlier, possibly because it attracted too much attention. At 8:23 a.m., as Ames drove south on North Randolph Street, approaching the intersection with Lee Highway, two FBI vehicles, a black Chevrolet Suburban and a dark blue Ford sedan, pulled in front of and behind his car, forcing him to stop. 4 FBI agents emerged from the vehicles with weapons drawn. Special Agent Les Weiser approached the driver's side window and knocked on the glass. Ames, according to Weiser's arrest report, sat motionless for approximately 5 seconds, his hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. Then he rolled down the window. Weiser identified himself, showed his credentials, and said, "Mr. Ames, you are under arrest for espionage. Please turn off the engine and exit the vehicle slowly with your hands visible." Ames complied without resistance. He turned off the engine, opened the door, stepped out, and placed his hands on the hood of the car as instructed. His face, according to Weiser's description, showed no particular emotion, not surprise, not fear, not anger. Just a kind of resigned acceptance. As agents placed handcuffs on his wrists, Ames said quietly, "I've been expecting this." Then, after a pause, "I want to speak to an attorney." Simultaneously, at the Ames residence, 6 FBI agents executed a search warrant. Rosario Ames, still in her nightgown, answered the door at 8:30 a.m. Agents presented her with the warrant and informed her that her husband had been arrested. According to the FBI report, Rosario initially appeared confused, asking repeatedly what the charges were. When told that her husband was accused of espionage, she said, "That's impossible. There must be some mistake." But as agents began searching the house, and as the reality of the situation became clear, Rosario's demeanor changed. She stopped protesting and sat silently on the living room couch, occasionally crying, saying nothing more. During the search, agents found additional evidence, including more classified documents, communications from Russian intelligence, and a shoebox in the basement containing approximately $45,000 in cash, $100 bills bound in bank wrappers. Rosario was arrested later that afternoon and charged with conspiracy to commit espionage and with tax fraud. The tax fraud charges related to the couple's failure to report the income Ames had received from Russian intelligence. The arrest made national headlines that evening. All 3 major television networks led their evening news broadcasts with the story. The Washington Post's headline the next morning read, "CIA officer arrested in spy case, accused of selling secrets to Russia." The story described Ames as a senior CIA officer who had caused catastrophic damage to American intelligence operations and who had been paid more than $2 million by the Soviets and Russians over 9 years. Within the CIA, the arrest triggered shock, anger, and a deep sense of betrayal. Officers who had worked with Ames, who had considered him a colleague, and in some cases a friend, struggled to understand how he could have betrayed them and their profession so completely. The realization that the compromises and deaths they had witnessed since 1985 had been caused not by bad luck or technical failures, but by deliberate human betrayal, was profoundly disturbing. Aldrich Ames was held without bail at the Alexandria Detention Center. His attorney, Plato Kacharis, met with him on February 22nd and advised him that the evidence was overwhelming. FBI agents had photographs of him conducting dead drops, recordings of conversations with his wife about his espionage, classified documents from his home, computer files containing operational information, financial records showing unexplained income, and surveillance from multiple countries. A trial would result in certain conviction, and the government was prepared to seek the death penalty. Kacharis negotiated with federal prosecutors. In exchange for a guilty plea and full cooperation in debriefing sessions where Ames would describe his entire espionage operation, prosecutors agreed to 2 conditions. They would not seek the death penalty for Ames, and they would recommend a relatively lenient sentence for Rosario, allowing her to return to Colombia after serving her prison term. On February 24th, 1994, Ames agreed to cooperate. Over the following 6 weeks, from late February through early April, he participated in extensive debriefing sessions with FBI and CIA investigators. The sessions, conducted in a secure facility in Northern Virginia, lasted 4 to 6 hours per day, 5 days per week. Ames provided detailed accounts of his entire espionage operation, how it began, what information he provided, how much money he received, how he communicated with handlers, what tradecraft he employed. The confession revealed the full scope of the damage. Ames admitted that he had betrayed more than 20 Soviet citizens who had been working for the CIA or FBI. He confirmed that his information had led directly to the executions of Dmitry Polyakov, Sergei Motorin, Valery Martinov, and Adolf Tolkachev. He identified several additional assets whose names remain classified, but who were also arrested and either executed or imprisoned. He described how he had provided information about CIA technical operations, about communications systems, about planned operations, about personnel assignments. When asked why he had done it, Ames offered the same rationalizations he had constructed over the years. He cited financial pressure. He claimed he had become disillusioned with American foreign policy. He suggested that the people he betrayed were themselves traitors and that their fates were inevitable. But under persistent questioning, these explanations revealed themselves as the self-serving justifications they were. The more honest answer, which Ames occasionally acknowledged, was simpler. He wanted money. He saw an opportunity to get it, and he took that opportunity despite knowing it would result in people's deaths. During one debriefing session on March 15, 1994, an FBI interrogator asked Ames whether he felt remorse for the people who had been executed because of his betrayal. According to the session transcript, Ames was silent for nearly a minute before responding. "They knew the risks. They chose to play the game. In intelligence work, people get hurt. That's just the reality." The interrogator pressed him. "These weren't abstract players in a game. These were real people with families. Their children grew up without fathers. Do you feel anything about that?" Ames, according to the transcript, replied, "I try not to think about it. This exchange, more than any other single piece of evidence, revealed Ames's moral character. He had constructed psychological defenses that allowed him to avoid confronting the human consequences of his actions. He had reduced complex moral realities to abstract games and inevitable outcomes. He had prioritized his own comfort and his own rationalizations over the lives of people who had trusted American intelligence to protect them. On April 28, 1994, Aldrich Ames appeared before Judge Claude Hilton of the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia for sentencing. The hearing lasted approximately 2 hours. Prosecutors presented evidence of the scope and damage of Ames's espionage, including testimony from CIA officers who had worked on the compromised operations and who described their sense of failure and betrayal. The Defense Intelligence Agency's damage assessment concluded that Ames's espionage represented possibly the most damaging case of espionage in CIA history. Ames's attorney argued for a sentence at the lower end of federal guidelines, emphasizing his client's cooperation, his expressions of remorse, and his agreement to assist in damage assessment. The attorney noted that Ames had provided information that helped investigators understand the full scope of compromises and that his cooperation had been valuable to the intelligence community's effort to rebuild its capabilities. Judge Hilton, in his sentencing remarks, rejected these arguments. He noted that Ames's cooperation had come only after his arrest and only in exchange for promises to protect his wife, not from any genuine remorse or desire to repair the damage he had caused. The judge emphasized that Ames had betrayed his oath, his profession, and his country. He noted that Ames's espionage had directly caused the deaths of at least 10 people and had compromised decades of intelligence work. He characterized Ames's motivations as fundamentally selfish and his rationalizations as morally bankrupt. Judge Hilton sentenced Aldrich Ames to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Under federal sentencing guidelines, this meant Ames would spend the rest of his life in custody with no opportunity for release. As the sentence was announced, Ames showed no visible reaction. He stood silently, then was led from the courtroom by federal marshals. Rosario Ames was tried separately. She initially maintained that she had not known about her husband's espionage and had believed the money came from his family or from investments. But prosecutors presented evidence contradicting this claim. Notes in her handwriting related to dead-drop procedures, recordings of conversations in which she discussed meetings with Russian handlers, and financial records showing her active involvement in managing the money Ames received. Faced with this evidence, Rosario eventually pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit espionage and to tax fraud. Her attorney argued that she had been manipulated by her husband, that she had not understood the gravity of what they were doing, and that she deserved leniency. On October 20th, 1994, she was sentenced to 5 years and 3 months in federal prison. Under the agreement her husband had negotiated, she was released after serving approximately 4 years and was deported to Colombia in September 1999. The impact of the Ames case extended far beyond the courtroom. Within the CIA, the case triggered a comprehensive review of security procedures, polygraph protocols, financial monitoring systems, and counterintelligence capabilities. Congressional committees held hearings examining how Ames had been able to spy for 9 years without detection. Director of Central Intelligence R. James Woolsey testified before Congress about the institutional failures and the reforms being implemented. Several senior CIA officials were disciplined or forced to retire because of their roles in missing warning signs about Ames. The agency's culture, which had been too trusting of its own officers and too reluctant to investigate colleagues based on suspicions, underwent significant changes. Financial disclosure requirements were strengthened. Polygraph procedures were revised. Counterintelligence staffing was increased. Random audits of employees' access to classified information were implemented. But these reforms, while important, could not undo the damage or bring back the dead. The people Ames had betrayed were gone. Dmitry Polyakov, who had provided valuable information to the United States for more than 20 years, had been executed at age 65. Sergei Motorin and Valery Martinov, both in their 30s with young children, had been executed. Adolf Tolkachev, the military researcher, had been tortured and executed. At least 6 others, whose names remain classified, had been arrested and either executed or imprisoned in labor camps where most died. Their families suffered consequences that extended across generations. Irina Motorina, Sergei's widow, spent years under suspicion and stigma, unable to work in her profession, forced to move to a remote location, living with minimal financial support. Her son, Mikhail, 10 years old when his father was arrested, grew up ashamed of his family name, never fully understanding why his father had been labeled a traitor or what he had actually done. Natalia Martinova, Valery's widow, was interrogated repeatedly by KGB investigators who suspected she had known about her husband's cooperation with American intelligence. Though eventually cleared, she lost her job and her social standing. Her daughters, 7 and 4 years old when their father was arrested, were expelled from their school and faced discrimination and bullying from other children who knew their father had been convicted of treason. Nina Polyakova, Dmitry's widow, never received a full explanation of what her husband had done or why. The Soviet government informed her only that he had been convicted of treason and executed. She died in 1992, 4 years after his execution, never knowing that her husband had spent 20 years trying to prevent nuclear war by providing information to the United States. These were the human costs: the wives who lost husbands, the children who lost fathers, the families who lived for years under stigma and shame. And they were costs that resulted directly from Aldrich Ames's decision to walk into the Soviet embassy in April 1985 and offer to betray his country for $50,000. For the American intelligence officers who had been case officers for the compromised assets, the emotional toll was also significant. These officers had recruited the assets, had developed relationships with them, had made promises that their identities would be protected. When those promises were broken through no fault of the case officers themselves, the sense of professional and moral failure was profound. Diana Worthen, a CIA officer who had been the primary handler for one of the compromised assets whose identity remains classified, later described in a published memoir the guilt she felt. She wrote, "I promised him we would protect him. I looked him in the eye and told him he could trust us, that we had systems and procedures that would keep him safe. When I learned he'd been arrested and executed, I felt I had personally betrayed him, even though intellectually I knew the betrayal came from Ames. That knowledge didn't make the guilt any easier to bear." Several CIA officers who had worked Soviet operations during this period left the agency after the Ames case. Some felt they could no longer trust the organization's ability to protect sources. Others struggled with the knowledge that a colleague had betrayed them so completely. The Ames case created lasting damage not just to specific operations, but to the culture and morale of the intelligence community. Aldrich Ames began serving his life sentence at the U.S. Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado, the federal supermax prison where the most dangerous and high-risk inmates were housed. He was held in solitary confinement in a small cell with minimal human contact under 24-hour video surveillance. The conditions were harsh, but justified by security concerns. Intelligence agencies feared that Ames might be targeted by other inmates or might attempt to communicate with Russian intelligence from prison. In 1998, Ames was transferred to a less restrictive federal prison in Allenwood, Pennsylvania, where he remained until 2015. During this period, he was allowed limited contact with other inmates and could participate in some prison programs. He worked in the prison library and took courses offered through the prison education program. Over the years, Ames has given several interviews to journalists and authors. In a 1998 interview with CNN, he was asked whether he felt remorse. He responded, "I feel remorse for the impact on my family. My daughter grew up without a father because of my choices. My son barely knows me. That's something I regret deeply. As for the people who were arrested in Russia, they knew the risks. They chose to commit treason against their country. I didn't force them to do that." This response generated significant public criticism. Former CIA officers, relatives of the executed assets, and intelligence community members condemned Ames's apparent lack of genuine remorse and his continued attempt to deflect responsibility. Senator Bob Kerrey, who had chaired the Senate Intelligence Committee during the investigation of the Ames case, issued a statement saying, "Mr. Ames's words demonstrate that he has learned nothing and has no understanding of the moral dimensions of what he did." In later interviews, Ames's statements became more carefully worded, though whether this reflected genuine evolution in his thinking or simply more strategic self-presentation is impossible to determine. In a 2012 interview with a documentary filmmaker, Ames said, "I understand that what I did caused terrible harm. People died. Families were destroyed. I can't undo that, and I carry that knowledge every day. Whether that constitutes adequate remorse or not, I can't say. It's not for me to judge." But even this more measured statement contained the same fundamental evasiveness, the passive voice. People died rather than I caused people's deaths. The vague acknowledgement of harm without clear acceptance of responsibility, the deflection to others to judge whether his remorse is adequate. Rosario Ames served her sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Phoenix, Arizona. She was released on September 21, 1999, having served 4 years and 11 months. She was immediately deported to Colombia. According to limited reports, she returned to Bogotá, where she lived with family members. She has never spoken publicly about her role in her husband's espionage, has declined all interview requests, and has maintained complete privacy about her life after prison. Rick and Rosario's son, Paul Ames, was 5 years old when his father was arrested. He spent his early childhood in Colombia in the care of Rosario's family while she was in prison. According to people familiar with the situation, Paul was not told the full truth about why his father was in prison until he was a teenager. He was told initially that his father had made mistakes at work and was being punished. Only as he grew older did he learn that his father had committed espionage and had caused people's deaths. Paul Ames has maintained no public presence. He has given no interviews. He uses his mother's maiden name rather than the surname Ames. According to a statement released through an attorney in 2014, Paul has had no contact with his father since childhood and has no desire for any relationship. Aldrich Ames's daughter from his first marriage, Allison, was 24 years old when her father was arrested. She had graduated from college and was working in marketing for a private company in Virginia. According to accounts from people who knew her, she was devastated by the arrest and by learning what her father had done. The father she had known, sometimes absent, often struggling financially, but generally kind and supportive when present, turned out to have been systematically betraying his country and causing people's deaths throughout much of her adolescence and young adulthood. Allison changed her surname, moved to a different city, and has maintained complete privacy about her experience. According to the single statement she released through an attorney in 1994, she was shocked and horrified by her father's crimes and wanted no association with him. Whether she has maintained any contact with him during his decades in prison is not publicly known, though most accounts suggest she has not. Nancy Ames, Rick's first wife, gave a single interview to the Washington Post in March 1994, shortly after his arrest. She described her shock at learning what her ex-husband had done. She said that during their marriage, which had ended in 1983, 2 years before he began spying, she had noticed nothing beyond his problems with alcohol and his frustration with his career. She expressed sympathy for the families of the people Rick had betrayed and emphasized that she had not known him during the years he was actively committing espionage. She declined all subsequent interview requests and has not discussed the case since. The damage assessment prepared by the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency in 1994 concluded that Ames's espionage had compromised at least 20, and possibly more than 30, Soviet or Russian citizens who were providing information to the CIA or FBI, technical operations including surveillance capabilities and communications systems, detailed information about CIA and military intelligence collection priorities and capabilities, information about hundreds of CIA officers, including those working undercover, and strategic intelligence that had informed American foreign policy and military planning throughout the late 1980s. The assessment estimated that it would take at least a decade for the CIA to rebuild its human intelligence capabilities against Russia, and that some losses were permanent. Assets who had provided information for years or decades could not be replaced. Trust that had been built over long periods had been destroyed. Relationships that had taken years to develop were gone. The financial cost of Ames's espionage, measured in operations that had to be abandoned, resources that had to be devoted to damage control and rebuilding, and legal costs associated with the investigation and prosecution, was estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars. But this financial calculation, while staggering, was trivial compared to the human cost. From a historical perspective, the Ames case stands as one of the most damaging espionage cases in American history. Only a few other cases are comparable in scope: the atomic spy cases of the 1940s and 1950s, the John Walker spy ring in the 1970s and 1980s, and the Robert Hanssen case that came to light in 2001. What distinguishes Ames is not just the damage he caused, but the length of time he was able to continue spying despite multiple warning signs. The question of what motivated Ames remains complex. The simplest explanation, that he wanted money, is accurate but incomplete. He was not in desperate poverty in 1985. He was financially stressed, certainly, but he had options. He could have lived more modestly, could have been honest with Rosario about his limitations, could have left the CIA and found other work, could have sought legitimate financial assistance. Part of what drove him was a sense of entitlement combined with resentment. He believed he deserved more than what he was receiving: more money, more respect, more recognition. He resented colleagues whom he perceived as less intelligent but more successful. He rationalized his betrayal by telling himself that the CIA did not deserve his loyalty, that the Cold War was morally ambiguous, that the people he betrayed were themselves traitors. These rationalizations reveal a profound capacity for moral self-deception. Ames needed to believe that what he was doing was somehow justified or at least understandable. He constructed a narrative in which he was not a traitor, but rather someone making difficult choices in morally complex circumstances. This narrative allowed him to continue his espionage for 9 years without being paralyzed by guilt, to spend the money without acknowledging its source, to interact normally with colleagues while knowing he was betraying them. The institutional failures that allowed Ames to spy for 9 years reflected broader problems within the CIA and the intelligence community. There was an assumption that officers who had passed background investigations and polygraph examinations could be trusted. There was reluctance to investigate colleagues based on suspicions or circumstantial evidence. There was a culture that valued operational success over security and that was structured to identify external threats rather than internal betrayal. Sandra Grimes, whose observation of the financial discrepancy in October 1989 eventually helped expose Ames, retired from the CIA in 2001 after 40 years of service. She received the CIA's Distinguished Intelligence Medal for her role in the investigation. In interviews given after her retirement, she expressed frustration at how long it had taken to identify Ames and grief over the people who had died during the years he spied undetected. She described the sense of professional failure she and her colleagues felt, that their job had been to protect assets and they had failed. Jean Vertefeuille, who led the task force that identified Ames, retired in 1992. Shortly after the investigation focused on him as the primary suspect. She also received the CIA's Distinguished Intelligence Medal. She and Grimes later co-authored a book, Circle of Treason, describing their investigation. Vertefeuille died in 2012 at the age of 80. According to people who knew her, she never fully recovered from the emotional toll of the case. The knowledge that while she and her team had eventually identified the traitor, they had done so too late to prevent most of the damage. FBI agents Les Weiser and Jim Milburn, who conducted the surveillance operation and arrested Ames, both received commendations from the FBI director. Weiser later became the head of the FBI's counterintelligence division. In interviews, he described the Ames investigation as both the most significant and the most disturbing case of his career. Significant because of the damage Ames had caused and the importance of stopping him. Disturbing because it revealed how vulnerable intelligence organizations were to betrayal from within. Aldrich Ames is now 83 years old. He has been in prison for more than 30 years and will remain in prison for the rest of his life. In 2015, he was transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution in Terre Haute, Indiana, where he currently resides. According to prison officials, his health is declining. He suffers from various age-related medical conditions, including hypertension and arthritis. He spends most of his time in his cell, reading and occasionally corresponding with journalists and researchers. In a letter to a researcher in 2019, Ames wrote, "I am 78 years old and have been in prison for 25 years. I will die in prison." That is justice, I suppose. Whether it is proportional justice or whether my punishment exceeds my crimes, I cannot judge. What I can say is that I think about the consequences of my actions every day. I think about the families I destroyed. I think about my own family. I think about the choices I made and whether, given the same circumstances, I would make different choices now. I would like to believe I would, but I honestly don't know. This statement, like his other attempts at reflection over the years, contains the same fundamental ambiguity. There is acknowledgement of harm, but continued uncertainty about responsibility. There is expression of thought about consequences, but no clear statement of remorse. There is speculation about whether he would make different choices, but no definitive claim that his actions were wrong. The people Ames betrayed are dead and have been dead for decades now. Dmitry Polyakov was executed in 1988. Sergei Motorin was executed in 1987. Valery Martynov was executed in 1987. Adolf Tolkachev was executed in 1986. At least 6 others whose names remain classified were arrested and either executed or imprisoned, and all are now deceased. Their families carried the burden of their treason for years. Their children grew up with shame and stigma. Their widows lived with loss and with questions that were never fully answered. These were the costs of Aldrich Ames's decision to walk into the Soviet embassy on April 16, 1985, and offer to sell classified information for $50,000. The money he received, more than $2.7 million over 9 years, bought him a house, a car, expensive vacations, and a lifestyle that satisfied his vanity and his wife's expectations. In exchange, he destroyed intelligence networks that had taken decades to build, caused the deaths of at least 10 people who had trusted American promises of protection, and inflicted trauma on their families that persisted long after their deaths. The investigation that eventually identified Ames began with Sandra Grimes noticing a financial discrepancy, a gap between a colleague's reported income and his visible spending. That observation, made on an October afternoon in 1989, took more than 4 years to result in an arrest. During those 4 years, Ames continued spying, continued receiving payments, continued compromising operations. The delay reflected institutional weaknesses, investigative challenges, and the difficulty of believing that a long-time CIA officer could be betraying his country so comprehensively. When the arrest finally came, on a February morning in 1994, it closed one chapter, but could not undo the damage. The operations were already compromised, the assets were already dead, the trust that intelligence work depends on had been shattered. The aftermath involved prosecutions, sentencing, reforms, investigations, and recriminations. But it could not bring back the dead or restore what had been lost. The question of responsibility in cases like this is complicated because it requires assigning moral weight among different actors operating within systems that shaped their choices. Aldrich Ames made the decision to commit espionage. He bears primary responsibility for that decision and its consequences, but he made that decision within a Cold War context that encouraged ideological polarization, within an intelligence bureaucracy that was poorly equipped to identify internal threats, and within a system that gave him access to information about people whose lives depended on that information remaining secret. The Soviet intelligence officers who recruited and ran him were operating within a system that valued intelligence collection above all else, and that treated human assets as tools to be exploited. The KGB officers who arrested, interrogated, and executed the people Ames betrayed were following orders within a totalitarian system that defined loyalty to the state as the highest virtue and treated betrayal as deserving of death. The CIA officers who failed to identify Ames for 9 years were operating within an organization that trusted its own personnel too much, that was reluctant to investigate colleagues, and that lacked adequate procedures for monitoring financial behavior or detecting internal threats. The victims, the Soviet citizens who provided information to American intelligence, were people who made their own choices, for their own reasons, with their own hopes and fears and calculations about risk. All of these individuals were, to varying degrees, acting according to the logic of the systems they inhabited, and all contributed to outcomes that caused suffering for people who had little or no agency, the families of the executed assets, Ames's own children, and many others whose lives were disrupted by events they did not control. The photograph that has become associated with the Ames case, a surveillance photo from FBI headquarters showing him being led away in handcuffs on the morning of his arrest, captures only a moment. It shows a middle-aged man in a gray suit, hands bound, being escorted by federal agents. His expression is blank, unreadable. There is nothing in the image that explains what he did, why he did it, or what it cost. But the image represents something larger, the moment when betrayal is exposed, when carefully maintained deceptions collapse, when the ordinary surface of a life reveals the moral corruption beneath. Aldrich Ames looked like an ordinary CIA officer. He lived in an ordinary house in an ordinary neighborhood. He drove ordinary cars and did ordinary things, and for 9 years, while maintaining this ordinary appearance, he systematically betrayed his country, his colleagues, and the people who had trusted American intelligence to protect them. The Ames case raises questions that extend beyond the specifics of his crimes. How do intelligence organizations protect against internal threats? How do they balance necessary trust in employees with appropriate skepticism and monitoring? How do they create cultures that encourage reporting of suspicious behavior without creating paranoia? How do they rebuild trust after systematic betrayal? These questions remain relevant decades later, as intelligence work continues to rely on human sources, on promises of protection, and on trust that is always vulnerable to betrayal. Aldrich Ames was 43 years old when he first walked into the Soviet embassy. He was 52 when he was arrested. He is now 83, having spent more than half his adult life in prison. He will die in prison. The question of whether he has achieved genuine understanding of what he did and genuine remorse for the suffering he caused remains unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. What is certain is that his choices destroyed lives, not just the lives of those executed, but also the lives of their families, the lives of his own family, and his own life. He traded all of that for money and temporary comfort and a sense of importance that proved hollow and that left nothing behind except suffering and regret.